John woke up early one morning and looked outside his window. Something felt strange because the streets were completely silent. There were no cars, no people, and no sounds from the city. He quickly got dressed and walked outside. He looked around and called his neighbor, but nobody answered. John started to feel nervous. He walked to the nearest coffee shop, but the door was wide open. Inside, the lights were still on, but nobody was there. A cup of coffee was sitting on a table, still warm. John looked behind the counter, but the place was completely empty. He checked his phone, but there was no internet or phone signal. He tried calling his family, but the call did not connect. John walked back into the street and looked at the tall buildings around him. Everything looked normal, but there was not a single person anywhere. He walked toward the city center, hoping to find someone. Suddenly, he heard a strange sound coming from a nearby building. John stopped walking and listened carefully. The sound came again, louder this time. Then he saw a light moving behind one of the windows. John slowly walked toward the building where he had seen the light. The main door was unlocked, so he pushed it open. Inside, the hallway was dark and completely silent. John turned on his phone flashlight and started walking upstairs. He could hear his own footsteps echoing through the empty building. When he reached the third floor, he saw a small room with light coming from underneath the door. John stood there for a few seconds and listened. He heard someone breathing inside. His heart started beating faster. He slowly opened the door and looked inside. There was a small radio sitting on a table. The radio was playing a strange message, again and again. If you can hear this, you are not alone. John moved closer to the radio and listened carefully. Then another voice suddenly spoke through the radio. John, if you are listening, leave the city before sunset. John froze when he heard his own name. John stepped away from the radio in shock. He could not understand how the voice knew his name. He looked around the room, but there was nobody there. The radio suddenly went silent. John picked it up and checked the batteries. They were completely dead. He quickly walked out of the room and ran down the stairs. When he reached the street, the sun was already starting to move lower in the sky. John looked at his watch and remembered the message. He had only a few hours before sunset. John decided to return home and get some important things. He needed food, water, a flashlight, and his backpack. As he walked home, he noticed something strange on the road. Hundreds of cars were stopped everywhere, but all the doors were open. John reached his apartment and quickly opened the door. Everything inside looked exactly the same as before. He grabbed his backpack and filled it with food and water. He also took a flashlight, some clothes, and his old map of the city. Before leaving, John looked at his family photos. He wanted to believe that his family was safe somewhere. He picked up his phone one more time and tried to call them. Suddenly, the phone showed one new message. The message came from an unknown number. It said, "Go to the old train station." John stared at the screen in confusion. He did not know who had sent it. Then another message appeared. "Do not trust anyone you meet." John left his apartment and started walking toward the old train station. The streets were getting darker every minute. He kept looking behind him because he felt that someone was watching him. But every time he turned around, the street was empty. After 20 minutes, John reached the train station. The huge building was completely abandoned. He pushed the main door open and walked inside. A single light was blinking above the old ticket office. John walked toward the light and saw a small backpack on the floor. He recognized it immediately. It belonged to his younger brother, Daniel. John picked it up and felt his hands begin to shake. John opened Daniel's backpack and found a small notebook inside. The first page had John's name written on it. He turned the page and found a short message. "If you find this, I am still alive." John felt a wave of hope. He quickly turned to the next page. Daniel had written about the empty city and the strange messages on the radio. He also wrote about a secret place outside the city. John continued reading until he found one final sentence. "I am going north. Follow the blue signs." John closed the notebook and looked toward the station entrance. He knew exactly what he had to do. John left the train station and followed the road north. The sky was becoming darker. He walked quickly, holding Daniel's notebook tightly in his hand. Every few minutes, he looked for a blue sign. After an hour, John finally saw one. It pointed toward a small road outside the city. John followed the road and entered a quiet forest. The city disappeared behind him. Suddenly, he heard a car engine. John stopped and hid behind a tree. A black car slowly passed along the road. Someone was driving it. John watched the car disappear into the darkness. John waited for several minutes before continuing. He was afraid that the person in the car might be dangerous. But he also wondered if the driver knew where Daniel was. John followed the road until he reached an old gas station. The black car was parked there. John slowly moved closer and looked through the window. Nobody was inside. Then he heard footsteps behind him. John turned around quickly. A woman was standing several meters away. She looked tired and frightened. "Are you John?" she asked. John stepped back and asked the woman how she knew his name. She introduced herself as Emma. She said she had been looking for him for 2 days. John showed her Daniel's notebook. Emma looked at it and immediately became serious. She told John that she had met Daniel before. He was alive, but he had gone to a hidden shelter. When John asked where the shelter was, Emma pointed toward the mountains. "It is about 30 kilometers from here," she said, "but we must leave before sunrise." Finally, John asked Emma what had happened to the city. She took a deep breath and said, "I do not know everything." She explained that people had disappeared suddenly. Some people left before the city became empty. Others simply vanished. Emma believed that someone knew what was happening. John looked at Daniel's notebook and wondered if his brother had discovered the truth. After driving for several hours, they reached the bottom of the mountains. The road became narrow and difficult. Emma stopped the car near an old bridge. "We have to walk from here," she said. John grabbed his backpack and followed her. They walked through the forest in complete silence. After 30 minutes, they saw a small blue light between the trees. Emma smiled and pointed toward it. "That is the shelter," she said. John suddenly heard a familiar voice calling his name. John ran toward the voice. A young man stepped out from behind the trees. It was Daniel. John could not believe his eyes. The two brothers hugged each other tightly. John had so many questions, but Daniel told him they had very little time. He quickly led them toward the shelter. Inside, John saw several people sitting round a large table. They were all watching a map on the wall. Daniel pointed at the map and said, "This is why everyone disappeared." John looked closely at the map. Cities were marked with red circles. Daniel explained that the same thing had happened in every city. People disappeared without warning. Electricity stopped working. Phone networks went down. Then the cities became completely silent. Daniel believed it was not an accident. Someone had planned everything. He showed John a small device they had found near the city. It was still sending a signal. John asked Daniel who was controlling the device. Daniel said nobody knew. They had tried to turn it off, but every time they did, another device appeared. Suddenly, the lights inside the shelter went out. Everyone became silent. A red light appeared on the wall. Then the radio turned on by itself. The same voice from the city spoke again. "John, you should not have come here." Everyone looked at John. He did not understand why the voice was speaking directly to him. Daniel told him that the messages had started after John disappeared from the city. John suddenly remembered something. Before the city became empty, he had found an old phone on the street. He had taken it home without thinking. John stared at the message. Everyone in the shelter moved closer to him. The phone began showing a map. A red line appeared on the screen and pointed back toward the city. Daniel said they had to return. John did not want to go back, but he knew they needed answers. The next morning, John, Daniel, and Emma left the shelter. They drove back toward the empty city. As they approached the city, they saw hundreds of lights turning on at the same time. The lights disappeared as quickly as they had appeared. John looked at the old phone. The map was still showing the same location. They followed the map to an underground building. The entrance was hidden beneath an abandoned supermarket. Daniel opened the door with a key he had found earlier. They walked down a long staircase. At the bottom, they discovered a huge control room. Hundreds of screens covered the walls of the control room. Each screen showed an empty city from somewhere around the world. John walked toward the largest screen. Suddenly, his face appeared on it. A timer started counting down. "What is happening?" John shouted. A voice answered from the speakers. "You have 10 minutes to make a decision." If John activated it, the people could return. But there was one problem. The system needed a human connection. John realized what that meant. Someone had to stay behind and control the system. Daniel immediately said he would do it. John refused to let Daniel stay behind. The brothers began arguing. Emma tried to find another way to activate the system. Suddenly, she discovered another button hidden under the main computer. She pressed it, and the screens changed. A message appeared. One person must choose. John looked at Daniel and understood that they had reached the final decision. John stepped toward the machine and placed his hand on the control panel. The room became completely silent. He remembered his family, his home, and the empty streets. He knew thousands of people were waiting for a chance to return. John pressed the button. The machine suddenly became brighter. A powerful sound filled the room, and the entire building began to shake. The lights in the control room began flashing. John felt a strange vibration moving through his body. Daniel shouted his name, but John could barely hear him. The old phone in his pocket started to become hot. Then the phone displayed one final message. "Thank you, John." The screen went completely black. Suddenly, everything became quiet. John opened his eyes and found himself standing outside. The city was no longer empty. Cars were moving through the streets, people were walking, and stores were open. John looked around in disbelief. Nobody seemed to remember what had happened. It was as if the empty city had never existed. John ran toward his home. When he opened the door, his family was sitting inside. His mother looked at him and smiled. "Where have you been?" she asked. John could not answer. He hugged her tightly and started crying. For the first time in days, he finally felt safe. John later met Daniel and Emma in a quiet cafe. They talked about everything that had happened, but there was one strange problem. Nobody else remembered the empty city. John checked his phone. There were no messages, no maps, and no strange signals. Everything looked completely normal, but every night he thought about the strange control room. He wondered who had created the system. One night, John woke up because his phone made a sound. He looked at the screen and saw a new message. The message contained only 3 words. "It is not over." John immediately sat up in bed. He checked the sender, but there was no number.com. Then his bedroom light turned off by itself. John slowly looked toward the window. Outside, the entire street was completely dark. John walked toward the window and looked outside. Every light in the neighborhood was off. John followed the map to an old building outside the city. The door opened before he even touched it. Inside, he found the same radio from the empty city. It was sitting on a table, waiting for him. John slowly picked it up. A familiar voice came through the speaker. "You saved one city, John. Now the world needs you." John looked at the radio and realized that his life had changed forever. He was no longer just an ordinary man. He had discovered a secret that could affect the entire world. Daniel and Emma soon arrived to help him. Together, they looked toward the dark city in the distance. John took a deep breath and said, "This is only the beginning."